Cheers to Cayman Brack and Little Cayman. Your station, your voice. All things Cayman. One radio, many people. This is home.
Radio Cayman in the Cayman Islands.
Money Sense is brought to you by the Chamber Pension Plan. For further information, visit chamberpension.ky. The Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan. We're here for you. We are a not-for-profit, member-centric plan with a democratically elected volunteer board of trustees representing all sectors of the Cayman Islands economy. We have an all-in expense ratio of less than 1%, over 20,000 members, and $490 million in assets under management. We were the first multi-employer pension plan approved by the regulator in the late 1990s, and today we are still strong, secure, and are here for our employees and employers alike. If you would like to join or require further information, visit chamberpension.ky. And for information as it happens, follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, or Instagram. Email admin@pensions.ky or call 745-7630. The Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan. We're here for you.
Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community.
About 2 weeks ago, the Bavarian district of Berchtesgadener land instituted a lockdown, a re-lockdown. Yesterday, the French said, "Hold my Bordeaux," and instituted a lockdown for the whole national economy until the end of November at the least. Generally speaking, looking at consumer, business confidence, financier confidence, we've seen an inflection to the downside from the hope of a recovery, of a V-shaped recovery, of the economy being turned off and being turned back on. That seems to be locked away, quarantined away now with the latest announcement of these lockdowns. My name is Emil Kalinowski. I am broadcasting to you live from the studios of Radio Cayman on 89.9 in Grand Cayman and 93.9 in Grand Cayman and Little Cayman. I am joined in the studio live with a professional gentleman of macroeconomics, Adam Newman.
Good morning, Emil.
How are you?
I'm very good. Had my caffeine, feeling good.
I also have had caffeine nonstop, so I'm very excited, and I can't wait to get going. A lockdown, re-lockdown, a second wave, Adam. But we're not epidemiologists. To my mother's great disappointment, I went into finance. Why couldn't I be like my cousin who went into medicine? I hear that often. But we're going to perform an a medical review of the financial system by identifying countries that may experience a second wave, not of the corona, but of a financial crisis, a potential sovereign debt default cycle, a bankruptcy cycle, some sort of financial crisis that may come as a result of the economy never recovering from the original lockdown and now being locked down again.
Yeah, I mean, certainly we the first part of the crisis was, particularly a health crisis, but we're now moving on to something much more sinister because it's an economic crisis, it's a political crisis, and it's a social crisis. This is a particularly dangerous phase. We never fully recovered. The jobs haven't come back. We haven't normalised. Governments were all ready to sort of remove some of the support for small businesses, for individuals. They can no longer do that, and so it's going to be interesting to see which countries can try and step in and try and support their economies as best they can and avoid a crisis, or at least manage the crisis better.
So I was a little bit depressed by what was happening, and what I usually do is I like to read something hopeful, cheerful, and so recently I've been reading A Brief History of Doom to kind of cheer me up. And this is a book by Richard Vague, and it's a tour of the last 200 years of financial history, identifying crises. And you know what he did? He found a very systematic way of identifying which countries may fall into financial crisis, and it's basically which countries have too much private debt growth. We often hear about national debt, and that's a problem. But let's say in 2008, it wasn't the national debt that caused the problem. It was the mortgage debt that caused the problem in the United States. So I got interested in this, and I said, all right, well, maybe there are objective measures by which we can measure countries, their debt loads, their debt burdens, and see if this means they're going to experience a financial crisis. And indeed, the Bank for International Settlements has provided a number of them, actually. And you just jump in at any point, because this part might be a little bit dry for the audience, so you liven it up. But so the first measure that we're going to discuss is a credit to GDP gap. And that's a fancy way of you're borrowing...
This is private credit to GDP
yes,
gap. Yes,
thank you, exactly. It's a fancy way of saying your country is borrowing much more than normal recently. The boom times, things are going so well. And so the Bank for International Settlements has a list of, let's say, 40-some countries, and they have data going back some 20, 30 years, and they report it quarterly, and they say, this is your trend, Hong Kong, this is your trend, Malaysia, this is your trend, Italy, and we're not going to say that there's a certain number that's bad relative to other countries, but relative to your own trend. If you're borrowing way more and more, what we found historically is that within 3 years of you going over a certain line, there's a very good chance that you are going to have a financial crisis. Go ahead.
And typically, where's this private credit being spent? I guess it varies from country to country, but we're looking at mortgage debt,
yes,
credit card debt. I guess it also depends where we are in the cycle.
That's right. And it's also business, because this is all private enterprise and households. So it's whatever businesses are spending their going into debt on, and whatever households are going into debt for. And mortgages is a big one. That's a big one. So, the most recently available data is March 2020. So, these numbers I would expect to be worse because GDP has fallen while debt has likely increased, right? And they have identified Hong Kong, Chile, Japan, Switzerland, Singapore, Korea, and France, which just went into lockdown, as countries that have tripped their objective measure. They also said China and Canada haven't tripped it recently, but have within the last couple of years. And this is a measure for the next 3 years. So I think we can add China and Canada as countries that are on the line. So that's just one measure. I got two more.
That's interesting, because Switzerland is often sort of held up as a country that's been quite responsible in terms of economic responsibility. So I'm quite surprised to see them at the top. And I think if we're looking down, we have, you said France was right at the top or very close to the top.
That's
Yet
right.
We have other countries in Europe, maybe surprisingly to some listeners, Ireland, Spain, Portugal and the Netherlands right down at the bottom. So again shows, the problems the EU faces, that you've got such disparity between these sort of measures, and yet they're all part of one union.
Those countries have paid off their debts as a result of they've deleveraged, as we like to say in the industry. And you're absolutely right. We don't have time, I suppose, in this show to discuss it. But yes, we've got a wide zoo of debt problems in Europe, and they're all being treated the same. That's a problem for the future. That's another show we can do. All right, so that's just one measure. The BIS provides another lens for us to look through, and it's called the debt service ratio, whereby now they're measuring the flow. The first one was kind of stock, right? How much debt versus how much GDP and your trend. Now they look at debt service ratio. So how much debt are you paying monthly, quarterly, interest payments versus what is your income? And again, they said, let's look at each country and then compare it to its own trend. We're not going to compare Hong Kong to Turkey. And what they have found is that if you're 1.8% above your 20-year trend, that's a danger sign. That means in the next 3 years, chances are good, 50-50, that you might have a financial crisis. Let me read the countries off again. Again, Hong Kong. Again, China. Again, Canada. Sweden makes the list. Russia, France again. Norway, Mexico, Turkey, and Switzerland just missed out. So I guess they don't make this next list. But we're hearing similar names.
The worrying thing there is that, part of this measure takes into account the fact that interest rates have dropped massively over time. In fact, we now have negative interest in rates in Europe, even to the point that some retail banks are charging their retail customers a negative amount to deposit. So this actually should make their metric look better ordinarily, and yet and it also suggests that the capacity to cut interest rates to help people pay back debt is not really there anymore. We can't cut interest rates much more than they are. So that's really worrying that this disposable income measure takes account of already very, very low interest rates, which previously crisis would have been, the response to crisis would have been to cut interest rates further, but we're already at ground zero on interest rates.
That's right. If interest rates do rise, if inflation does take off, woo-wee.
That debt servicing is unmanageable.
One last measure, I know, before the audience turns off, because math at 7:30, sweet Lord. Here we go. We've got one last measure, and this one incorporates, again, private debt, but it what would the word be? It emphasizes, it encourages it, it enhances it by also measuring residential property prices in real terms. As you brought up earlier, you said mortgages. And this was a measure done by a report that was released in, I believe it was August, and it's in the National Bureau of Economic Research. And again, they went through a list of some 50 countries, going back as far as they possibly can, 1950, I believe. And they said if you are in the top third on residential real estate real growth, and if you're in the top fifth in your household debt growth, if you combine those two measures, within the next 3 years, you can experience a financial crisis. And who do they point out again? They point out Australia, Canada, China, and the Slovak Republic. Sorry, Slovaks.
It's interesting because actually, if you look at real estate prices in the US, despite having, certainly being in potentially a recession or worse, we've actually seen property prices increase across the US, which means, people out of work, how on earth are they going to be able to pay back those mortgages, and house prices get less and less affordable, which only makes a crisis that much more likely.
One of the good news is for the United States. The bad news is there's an election coming up, but the good news is that the measures, these objective measures that academicians with much better degrees than I possibly have, who've spent all this time on this, say this is a real good measure, predictive measure. They say the United States is looking okay. They've deleveraged like Ireland and other countries. So I think we can say that we've got some countries, France, Canada, China, Australia, I don't know, Hong Kong. Hong Kong seems to be part of China, that are in trouble if the economy worsens, if debt servicing increases. And I think we can look to those countries as perhaps being the epicenters of another financial crisis. These measures are all about like 50-50 because nothing's certain, right? So they're saying 50-50, but it's three different measures identifying these countries. What should we talk about in the when we come back from the break?
Well, I think it's we can see where this crisis is going. The economy's suffering, debt levels continue to increase. So be interesting to chat about what we think government's response, central banks' response around the world is going to be to this crisis, and whether or not they're going to be effective. And then also what that might mean for investors in terms of asset allocation, how to think about the world in the sort of next 5-10 years.
Perfect. All right, Susan, we're going to go to a break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the second wave, the financial second wave.
the Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan. We're here for you. Did you know that between May and August 31st, in support of the COVID-19 Emergency Withdrawal Program, the Chamber Pension Plan leveraged IT and human resources to successfully review over 16,000 member applications, approve over 12,000 applications, and paid over CI $130 million to our plan members. We are the Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan, and we're here for you. For further information regarding the Emergency Withdrawal Program, visit chamberpension.ky. And for information as it happens, follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, or Instagram. Email admin@pensions.ky or call 745-7630.
This is
Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community. Brought to you by the CFA Society Cayman Islands.
And now, more Money Sense.
Welcome back, everyone. Emil Kalinowski here with Adam Newman. We're discussing the second wave of the financial economic crisis that's developing. Not the second wave of the corona crisis, but the lockdowns that are being put in place on an economy that is already hobbled. In the first part of the show, we discussed objective measures released by academicians. I can't say that word. And I've only been drinking coffee, but I still can't say it. Intelligent people at financial institutions who study these sort of things, and they say there are these objective measures of private debt, and there are certain countries that are coming up on the list, Canada, China, France, as being stressed, and now they're heading into a difficult economic period. Adam, what may happen next? What are the governments going to do? Do we have...
Yeah, I wrote this. I wrote a report back in March this year, actually end of February, beginning of March this year, talking about this and the expectations for what how governments are going to react to all of this. It was clear that with lockdowns, the economy seizing up, there's going to be a financial crisis. What the expectation was at the time was that governments are going to do everything in their power to try and support the economy, and that is typically has been done through increasing central banks' balance sheets. Fiscally, in terms of government spending, governments have tried to be more conservative, particularly in the EU, the last few years. So it's been left to central banks around the world to effectively print money. And what we saw in the US was actually print money and give it straight into the pockets or the bank accounts of individuals. So they received stimulus checks of $1,200. I wrote my title of my report was called "Crazy is Going to Get Crazier," and I absolutely think we're probably only in innings 1 or 2 of that. Anything we thought wasn't possible, we're going to see is actually is possible in terms of the amount of printing. So we've already seen central banks print something like $5 trillion in extra money, and they're going to continue to do that. But they're not going to continue to do that alone. They are going to demand, and we've seen from the IMF, that governments also support. So governments are going to have to spend as well to try and support the economy. But all of this is at a time when it's hard. You can print money, but you can't print jobs. And if people are locked down, governments are effectively going to have to substitute their employees' check by printing money. So we're going to see more stimulus checks and money distributed into the hands of people. But this doesn't, this is not a long-term solution, because if people don't have jobs, ultimately, they can't live off, or it's not a good society that lives off handouts. So, the question then becomes how far can governments go? And I'm looking here. We're starting from a pretty high base in terms of countries' fiscal government debt to GDP. So most of the big developed countries already exceed a debt to GDP of 100, which I think, was it Rogoff wrote about how if debt to GDP exceeds 80%, we're in a dangerous place. I'm reading down the list, and Japan has a debt to GDP of 266%. Next, and they're by far the outlier, but Italy is up there at 162%, USA down at 131%, UK at 108%. So all these countries you would think do not have an awful lot of room to take on more debt. And actually, those measures are probably slightly distorted by the fact that GDP is slower and debt has been increasing. But let's be clear, governments are not going to see a particular level as a hurdle. They have to print. There is no other option. So we will start to see fiscal measures, hopefully spending on some more productive things such as infrastructure, rollout of mobile networks, building of roads and stuff. And that will be in the next phase. And although we have this very polarized US election, let's be clear that either candidate, both candidates, are going to print more money. Government is going to spend more money to support the economy, and they will continue to do this, until the recovery is cemented. The problem is, at some point, and this is a big debate, is does this ultimately lead to inflation? And as you point out, Emil, with all these high debt levels, inflation is probably one of the worst things that can happen, unless it's accompanied by very strong growth, because then that helps you to pay down your debt. But if we're having inflation without the commensurate economic growth, that just becomes harder and harder to pay down that debt, because interest rates rise, and that makes your borrowing costs rise.
I love it. There's so much to talk about. Let me make a nuanced point here. You said that government will be printing money and has been. I think you would agree, pre-2020, central banks were printing money that is called bank reserves. That's money for banks. Now we are entering a world where government, the Ministry of Finance, the Parliament, the Congress, the executive branch, will be printing money that will be going to people. And so it's a new world that we're entering. What do you think?
100%, yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So, yes. So then we may create inflation with this new method. And if we create economic activity, self-reinforcing economic activity, great. Everyone's a winner. But we've been trying to do that for 13 years, and it's not worked. You said inflation would be a bad thing but let me say this, it would be a bad thing for people with savings and money, but it wouldn't be a bad thing for people with debt, because that inflation would eat away at debt. Who has debt? Most of the population. Who has savings? Not very big proportion of the 1%, let's call it. The government and most of the people are in debt, and there's a small pool of people with savings who I think are going to be the targets of this new era that we're entering in. And you also said, and this is controversial, you also said that inflation would be bad because interest rates would then naturally rise, forcing those that are in debt, including the government, to pay the market-going rate, right? Because I'm a bank, I extend money to you on a floating rate basis, and inflation's going up, so I'm going to adjust your interest rate so that I can make a return. What do you say to the idea that the government's going to say that they don't care very much for these market-determined rates anymore, and you know what? I'm going to set what the interest rate is, Mr. Bank, and we're going to return to an era like after the Second World War, when we also had a tremendous amount of debt, and there were regulations put in place that capped interest rates below the going rate of inflation, and that ate away at the debt. Do you see that we might be entering this radical world that I'm describing?
Absolutely. I think it's almost impossible for governments to allow, in an environment where inflation is rising, and I'd imagine inflation is rising without a commensurate economic activity, it's almost impossible for governments to allow that to creep up too much, because the inflation would hurt the economy. So we're very much likely to see repression of interest rates, capping interest rates. But what that ultimately does is it doesn't take away the inflation. It most likely pushes the inflation out to different parts of the economy and markets. So we could enter, even though it feels like we've been in a bubble situation with markets, particularly equities lately, we could actually end up pushing those equity prices even higher. I would expect the reaction of commodities to be very, very, very strong. So I imagine commodity prices to go up. So even though the interest rate, the rate set by central banks or your bank may be stable, you will feel inflation and you'll feel the inflationary pressure elsewhere. And also, if commodity prices going up, the cost of basic goods will also be going up, etc.
Unless they institute price controls, as they did in the past.
Which is starting to feel very socialist.
No, that's right. But I think that's where we're heading, and that's the sort of world we're heading towards. I was listening to a podcast interview, Macro Voices with Eric Townsend. It's a very popular podcast, and I recommend it. And he was interviewing Miss Professor Stephanie Kelton just last week, and she is famous for being a proponent of something called modern monetary theory, which is the idea that government will print money. That's it. They'll print the money, and then they'll invest it and hand it out, and that's it, period.
The view is that there's no sort of consequences. There's no amount of money that they can't print, and there aren't consequences from printing. The interesting thing, and we probably haven't got time to talk all about this because it's quite a controversial theory, but a theory that is gathering more popularity, is if governments are not hampered in the amount of money they can print, why do we all pay taxes? I mean, if they can literally hand us money to not work, you kind of, you then wonder whether we should all be paying taxes at all. And this was actually an interesting idea that I think people like Peter Thiel have, that actually, in the age of technology and robotics, eventually none of us will work. We'll only pursue activities that we enjoy, arts, sports and stuff.
Broadcasting on the radio. And then the government pays us to effectively do nothing, and we don't have to pay taxes. But that's a quite a far out there view. Well, the taxes, maybe you don't have to pay taxes, but the government or the people in charge of the government feel that perhaps taxes are a tool to shape the society. So perhaps the wealth inequality is too high and therefore will raise the personal income tax and redistribute money. Or perhaps they don't, I like the idea of smoking or rum or anything along those lines, and so they'll discourage that behavior by raising taxes. We've got a few minutes left, but I think the bottom line is, and you tell me if you disagree, we've been on this trend. We've tried austerity after 2008. It wasn't too well received. We've tried central bank printing. It didn't seem to create an economic activity that we were used to before 2008. Now we've had this second crisis, and we got caught again. There's another wave coming. And I think we're transforming the global economy. Government will have to step in. Debt levels are going to rise tremendously, and they're going to have to implement radical new policies, financial repression, inflation, and I think they're going to be coming after savers, saving pools. And as you said, but there are avenues, there are ways to invest to try to get away. Commodities, stocks, which we'll be talking about over the coming years. What do you think of this roadmap for the next 10 years?
Well, interesting. It's certainly, if we look at who are the savers, who are the people who actually have money, it tends to be the older generation, the boomers. And actually, one of the biggest problems with society at the moment is this wealth inequality. So absolutely, the savers are likely to be handicapped in the, as part of this wealth transfer. So I think also, within all of this, we need to talk about the US dollar. And although, again, controversial or polarizing, my view is ultimately the US dollar will demise in its importance. It will still remain a currency, but I think we might end up moving away from having one single global reserve currency. It puts an awful lot of pressure on one country to be the effectively global policeman for monetary policy. And I think that will happen over time, and it may only expedite it if we have a strengthening dollar. So I think looking further down the line, we move towards more inflation in real assets, and we move to a weaker dollar environment.
Great show, Adam. And as usual, we've run out of time. There's only a few seconds left, and I guess I have to tell the audience that if you've enjoyed this show, please call our moms and tell them how much you've enjoyed the show, because they would love to hear that. But you can also rewatch the show if we talk too fast. If I couldn't pronounce the word academician, dang it, I can't do it. You can see it on YouTube, on the Radio Cayman YouTube channel. And of course, if you have questions, you can find us on Twitter at Money Sense Radio. Adam, where can they find you on Twitter?
You can find me on Twitter at from_10,000 feet. I'm quite active on there in terms of sharing my views.
Fantastic, fantastic. Everybody have a great day, and we'll see you again in a fortnight.
Money Sense is brought to you by the Chamber Pension Plan. For further information, visit chamberpension.ky. The Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan. We're here for you. We are a not-for-profit, member-centric plan with a democratically elected volunteer board of trustees representing all sectors of the Cayman Islands economy. We have an all-in expense ratio of less than 1%, over 20,000 members, and $490 million in assets under management. We were the first multi-employer pension plan approved by the regulator in the late 1990s, and today we are still strong, secure, and are here for our employees and employers alike. If you would like to join or require further information, visit chamberpension.ky. And for information as it happens, follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, or Instagram. Email admin@pensions.ky or call 745-7630. The Cayman